My name is Simona Ginsburg, and I'm a neuroscientist. Eva Jablonka, who is an evolutionary biologist, and I, through many years of discussions, have taught each other our fields. We are both also philosophers of biology. With some trepidation, we dared to embark on investigating one of the most engaging topics that brings together science and philosophy, the problem of consciousness. We published a book in which we represented our theory, which in a nutshell claims that consciousness evolved with the appearance of a very special type of open learning. In our lectures, we try to describe how the theory was built. What do we mean by consciousness? We use consciousness as synonymous to subjective experiencing and sentience. It includes many experiences we are all familiar with: a painful nagging toothache, smelling coffee brewing in a macchinetta, remembering a face, hearing your name called out in a cocktail party, breathing fresh air after being confined to a stale cell. Minimal consciousness or sentience, then, is the most basic, non-reflective, subjective feeling. It includes experiences that are exteroceptors, for instance, those related to seeing and hearing, interoceptive, like thirst and hunger, and proprioceptive, like feeling the position of our body. Many questions spring to mind when we reflect on subjective experiencing. Why is it necessary? Why can't information be processed, information about the world and our bodies, why can't it be processed without this special feel? Who is conscious? Only humans, or maybe other creatures? And what is the relation between the mind, the mental aspect of our life, and our body and brain, the physical part? The neuroscientist Sherrington expressed his wonder by focusing on the subjective experience of seeing. When I turn my gaze skyward, I see the flattened dome of the sky and the sun's brilliant disk and 100 other visible things underneath it. What are the steps which bring this about? A pencil of light is focused there on the retina. It gives rise to a change, which in turn travels to the nerve layer at the top of the brain. The whole chain of these events from the sun to the top of my brain is physical. Each step is an electrical reaction. But now there succeeds a change wholly unlike any which led up to it and wholly inexplicable by us. A visual scene presents itself to the mind. I see the dome of sky and the sun in it and 100 other things beneath it. Sherrington expresses here the mind-body problem. What is the relation between the mental and the physical, and how can the mental be produced from the physical? There are several philosophical stands on the issue, of which I will mention but three: dualism, panpsychism, and physicalism. Dualists assume that the mental, the mind, is not identical with the physical, the body. Some maintain that the physical and the mental are two kinds of stuff that pervade all substances, while others think that only human rational thinking requires mental stuff. If one believes that the mind and the body are different kinds of stuff or properties, do the mind and body interact? How is it that a state of mind such as sadness causes a physical state? And how, conversely, can physical changes in the body, like consuming a drug, cause mental changes? And what is the self? Is it an attribute of the body or of the mind? Panpsychists claim that sentience, the ability to feel and perceive, is a fundamental and pervasive feature of all things. They believe that there is one substance only, which is both fundamentally physical and fundamentally mental. They assume that there are intrinsic properties of things that cannot be understood in terms of physics. Panpsychism takes several forms, while some argue that everything has a degree of subjective experiencing, including your cup of tea. Others think that there are two types of experiencing, micro and macro. The micro experiencing of elementary particles like quarks is different from the macro experiences of a toothache. So how, one wonders, does the experience of, say, elementary particles in your tooth combine to form macro experiences of a toothache? Physicalists identify mental properties with physical states and processes, typically neuro or neurophysiological ones. They assume that consciousness pervades all matter, everything. A clear example of this position was articulated by Francis Crick. You, your joys and sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. This statement hides many complexities. The vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules is, as Crick himself assumed, an organized assembly. So what kind of organization is it? Can isolated brains be conscious? Are nerve cells both necessary and sufficient for consciousness? Neuroscientists who study consciousness often differ in the way they approach these questions, but they share the same broad philosophical approach. They regard consciousness as the outcome of the self-organizing dynamic interactions between low-level parts of the neural system and higher levels of the system. These neural dynamics give rise to coherent images, feelings, and actions. The question is how this could happen. Even if consciousness can be experimentally manipulated, and even if perfect neural and body correlates of consciousness can be identified, why is it that these correlations entail subjective experiencing? Why are we not zombies? And why do we feel that our mental activities are qualitatively different from our physical activities? Our own scientific naturalistic view is an evolutionary one. We think that consciousness evolved, and we argue that it appeared as a transition from animals who had no consciousness to those that had sentience and subjective experiences, even if their consciousness was just minimal and very far from our own human reflective consciousness. The fact that animals, other than ourselves, are at least minimally conscious and sentient has gained support in the past decades by an increasingly larger number of philosophers and scientists. In 1220, a group of biologists signed the Cambridge Declaration stating, convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. And recently, several months ago, scientists and philosophers in the United Kingdom wrote a detailed report that will enter the Animal Welfare Act in the United Kingdom. Drawing on over 300 scientific studies, we have evaluated the evidence of sentience in two groups of invertebrate animals, the cephalopod mollusks, or for short, cephalopods, including the octopus, the squid, and cuttlefish, and the decapod crustaceans, or for short, decapods, including crabs, lobsters, and crayfish. Among the studies that convinced biologists that non-human animals are conscious are also our own evolutionary studies. I have already said that according to our approach, consciousness evolved. It is fairly new to find scientists who take an evolutionary approach to the question of consciousness. And among scientists who do, there are at least 7 hypotheses for the origin of consciousness. They include the hypothesis that consciousness originated only once in humans or twice in vertebrates and cephalopods. Other hypotheses maintain that sentience began in amniotes or 3 times in mammals, birds, and cephalopods. And there are those who find evidence for the dawn of subjective experiencing separately in vertebrates, arthropods, and mollusks. There are also those who believe that consciousness developed once the first living creatures appeared. In other words, it exists in all living organisms. And finally, there are those who believe that consciousness pervades all matter, physical, whether living or not living. It is a primitive. How can one develop an evolutionary theory of consciousness when there are so many disagreements about consciousness? I mentioned the various philosophical approaches and which organisms are conscious. Our way of approaching this question was inspired by the way the Hungarian chemist Tibor Ganti tackled a similar problem, the problem of how life began. Also, a very difficult question. He looked at the transition from non-living matter to the first living organisms. Ganti started by compiling a list of capacities that, in spite of the different views about the nature of life, are generally deemed jointly sufficient for the simplest minimal life. Ganti listed these hallmarks as maintenance of a boundary separating the entity from the environment, metabolism, dynamic persistence, information storage, regulation of the internal milieu, growth, reproduction, and of course, also death. If we found on a distant planet a being that exhibits all these capacities, most scientists would agree that it is alive. The functional and structural coupling among the mechanisms and processes that implement these capacities make up a minimal living entity. But it is not always easy to detect or dissect out each of these hallmarks in an entity that we study. Is there a single marker that requires the presence of a system with all these capacities? Following Ganti, the evolutionary biologists Maynard Smith and Satmari proposed that there is. It is unlimited heredity. By that, they meant the capacity to form lineages that differ in open-ended ways from the initial system, so that the number of possible variants is so vast that it could not have been explored by real lineages given the age of the universe. Such a system would be sustainable over evolutionary time. The DNA-based heredity system is an example of an unlimited heredity system. With a transition marker for life, Ganti could proceed to build a theoretical model of a minimal living system that implements all the capacities for life. An evolutionary transition marker is a property such that when we find evidence for it, we have evidence that the major evolutionary transition in which we are interested has gone to completion. The transition marker allows us to reverse engineer the system that enables it. Like paleontologists who can reconstruct a whole animal from a single part, theoretical biologists and chemists can reconstruct a minimal living system if they find structures that implement the capacity for unlimited heredity. So, if we found on a distant planet several long polymers, molecules made up of different units like DNA, we would infer that there must have been a system that enabled the synthesis and maintenance of such complex molecules, because they could not have been generated spontaneously. The ordered complexity of the polymers would suggest that they had to be synthesized by other specialized molecules within a spatially distinct self-reproducing system with an intricate maintenance machinery. And since the structure of the polymers suggests that their properties enable them to be copied with variations, we would infer that one of their functions is information storage, and that they allowed the system as a whole to persist for long evolutionary periods. The unlimited hereditary capacity of the polymers is then diagnostic of a minimal, evolutionarily sustainable life. Our evolutionary approach to studying consciousness was to look for an evolutionary marker of the transition to consciousness. In her lecture, Eva will show you what it is. Thank you.